If you would have asked me 5 years ago what the on-trend brewing thing would be in 2021, I never would have guessed that hard seltzer water would be so popular. Laugh all you want, but hard seltzer is a fantastic day drinker and likely isn't going anywhere in the near future. Imperial Yeast's new seasonal strain, W04 Paramount, can help brewers get the most out of their seltzer fermentations. A clean and aggressive fermenter, Paramount will produce an excellent seltzer with low fusel alcohols, and it's produced in a gluten-free medium. If you've tried making seltzer with standard ale or lager strains, you know the struggle, and Imperial Yeast is here to help with W04 Paramount. Check it out at imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. It's commonly accepted that humans can recognize 5 basic tastes: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. In beer, we play around with a lot of those flavors, especially sweet and bitter, but salts matter too, like sulfate and chloride, and also sourness. And that last taste, sourness, is a flavor I really enjoy in beer, but sometimes it can be elusive to get it right. I'm your host, Cade Job, and today in the lab I'm talking with Daniel LePage of Creature Comforts Brewing Company in Athens, Georgia, about their process for making kettle sours. Their flagship kettle sour is Athena, which they refer to as a refreshingly gentle, tart, German-style wheat beer. And you'll see that achieving that balance of tartness to be both gentle and refreshing is actually quite difficult to do. They've had a number of challenges over the years, like deciding which lactobacillus culture to use, what mash regime and souring steps to use, expanding to a second brew house, monitoring iron accumulation, maximizing foam, and lots more. So in today's episode, we're going to take a dive into Creature Comforts' kettle souring process, and I think some things will surprise you. Spoiler alert, Creature Comforts is able to sour their beers in about 2.5 to 4 hours. You heard that right. Not 18 hours or 24 hours. 2.5 to 4 hours. That's crazy. And you'll hear how and why they're able to do that and some of the interesting challenges that they've had to overcome. It should be a lot of fun, so stay tuned. But first, I wanted to say another big thank you to our patrons. None of this would be possible without you, and if you're currently not a patron, I encourage you to head to patreon.com/Brewlosophy and check out the monthly contribution levels. In addition to the feel-good vibes of helping to support the work we do here at Brewlosophy, you get access to a bunch of awesome rewards depending on the different pledge level that you choose. You can get access to Brewlosophy contributor recipes that we've never published, new discounts each month to YakimaValleyHops.com, and for $3, access to a monthly live Q&A session with a special guest from the brewing industry. This month's guest is none other than Jamil Zainasheff, a homebrewing legend, author of Brewing Classic Styles, and co-author of the Yeast Book, which is part of the Brewing Elements series from the Brewers Association. If you haven't checked out either of those books, you are totally missing out. Brewing Classic Styles has lots of recipes. He brewed gold medal winning beers of every style in the BJCP, at least at the time that the book was released. And he's also co-author of the Yeast Book, which I refer to as the Yeast Bible. And if you're kettle souring or doing anything with sour beers, you need to talk about yeast stress and understand how yeast metabolizes and ferments. So please read that book, or join the Q&A session and ask him questions about those things. He's got an incredible amount of information about both home brewing and commercial brewing, and he'll be available in July to answer your questions. So I hope you'll take advantage of this great reward by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Thank you to everyone that's left a rating or review of the show. I really appreciate hearing from you. Those ratings help other listeners like you find the show, and without the reviews, we wouldn't have series like the Applying the Science series with Jordan, so keep them coming. If you haven't yet rated or reviewed the show, I'd love for you to do so. Feedback is brought to you by the team at Haas, who are constantly innovating to provide solutions to your brewing problems. And we've all had hazy IPAs, and since you're listening to this show, you know that getting a stable haze can be a challenge. Imagine you've brewed this awesome hazy IPA, you added your Whirlpool and dry hops, it looks great while fermenting, and then drops crystal clear after you crash it. Well, the folks at Haas have you covered. Introducing Hop Haze, their newest brewing product. Hop Haze can be used in post-fermentation to add a stable hazy complexion to beer and other beverages. It's 100% hop-derived, flavorless in beer, and requires no additional mixing before use, and the haze stability is the same as the shelf life of your beer. So if you want to achieve that juicy look in your next hazy IPA, be sure to try Hop Haze, and also check out all of Haas's other innovative products at johnihaas.com. That's John, the letter I, Haas.com. All right, listener Kevin wrote in. He said, "Hey, Kate, I saw your interview on the Brewlosophy show the other day and have been trying to find a link to the Brew Lab. No luck. Really want to listen to your podcast. I'm in the middle of a low-gravity starter that you talked about, but I can't seem to find a link to the full podcast. Plus, I want to listen in on others as well. Thanks, Kevin." Hey, Kevin, thanks for watching the Brewlosophy show. You can find the links to the Brew Lab on all major hosting services where you can listen to podcasts like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Libsyn, Stitcher, and all the others. You can also stream all of the episodes from the Brewlosophy website. Just go to brewlosophy.com, mouse over podcasts, or click podcast in the menu and select the Brew Lab. And all episodes are available to stream for free. And before anyone writes feedback about this feedback, it occurs to me as I'm giving this that the feedback response he's looking for the podcast link episode, and I'm giving this feedback on the podcast, right? So he clearly isn't going to get this information. Don't worry, I've sent him a separate email, but I wanted to put his feedback in here because people come to Brewlosophy from all different channels. So if you're listening to this show, for example, but haven't watched the Brewlosophy show, go watch it. You can find it on YouTube, and it's also linked through brewlosophy.com website. And of course, we have the Brewlosophy podcast, the sister podcast that launched the entire podcast series here at Brewlosophy. And there's lots of content over at brewlosophy.com website. So if you're coming to Brewlosophy through the Brew Lab, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we do here, and you should definitely go check it out. Again, check out all that information at brewlosophy.com. All right, I'll be back in a few minutes with Daniel LePage to talk about kettle souring at Creature Comforts Brewing Company. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app. It's summertime, so I'm craving those light, crushable, easy drinkers that are perfect for the hot summer months, sitting outside with grilled foods next to a place for a refreshing swim. It's the perfect weather for a crisp, refreshing sour beer. That's right, I said sour beer. With me today in the lab to talk about their unique methods for making refreshing kettle sours is Daniel LePage from Creature Comforts Brewing Company in Athens, Georgia. Welcome to the Brew Lab, Daniel.
Thanks, Gabe. Excited to have a chat.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. So, Daniel, it gets hot in Georgia, right? I mean, and I guess you're also about to open a location in Los Angeles, California, where it also gets warm.
Yeah, we're looking for those tasty cold snacks right about now. So.
Yeah, for sure. What are your go-to beers for hot summer days?
Oh man, for the hot summer days, our classic American Pilsner, Classic City Lager is hard to beat. But I will argue till the day I die that probably the best sour beer that I ever had is one of our kettle sours.
That's amazing.
Tritonia, it's a Goza, so it has that salt and the coriander, and then we also add lime and cucumber. And
nice.
You come in, you're just covered in sweat, from the Georgia or California summer, and you drink one of those in the shower, and it's absolutely sublime.
When you just need that sour beer, go for a Goza. I like it. That's hilarious. I'm like you, but it sounds like my flavor tastes are very similar, right? I'm kind of a light lager Pilsner man myself, especially in those hot summer days. But I worked at a brewery in Austin that brewed sour beers, and I developed this massive appreciation for that, like just tartness, that subtle, refreshing tartness, and it just adds something. It's thirst quenching and great. And Creature Comforts, of course, makes a lot of refreshing beer, not just kettle sours that we're talking about today. You've got a whole line of Pilsners and IPAs and double IPAs, Imperial IPAs. But the ones that we're talking about today are your kettle sours because, as I understand it, Creature Comforts does some things a little unique when it comes to their kettle souring technique. But before we get there, I always want to start the show talking about you. So you are Daniel LePage. You are the Director of Quality at Creature Comforts. How did you originally get into quality or brewing science, that sort of stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my background, I did my undergrad at the University of Tulsa in biochemistry, and then PhD. It's great. I love it. But not for everyone.
No. Tulsa's totally fine. I don't have anything against Tulsa. I'm from Texas, Oklahoma, But
did my PhD at Vanderbilt in kind of a microbiology focused lab. And, if you had asked me the beginning of grad school, I wanted to become a professor and stay in research and stuff like that. But as I started to get more plugged into the brewing community and home brewing and stuff like that, I saw that there was this fantastic opportunity for scientists in brewing. And the more I learned about craft beer and the industry in general, I saw that, and I feel this pretty strongly, that craft beer has all of the good things of academia and not many of the bad. So same collaborative nature, pushing the boundaries, always trying something new, really solid research and science and getting to dabble in a whole bunch of different things. It was really, really appealing to me.
Yeah.
So at the end of grad school, turned down 3 academic job offers and sold my condo, ran, and only applied to breweries. So eventually found my way to Creature.
Nice. Yeah. I found your way to Athens, Georgia, which apparently is a great, a really fun town. Obviously University of Georgia's there. So, I'm sure there's a huge football culture in Georgia.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Athens is very happy right now because the dogs are doing well. So
yeah, the dogs are doing great. Actually, well, we're not going to nerd out on this, but I am a huge Texas football fan too, and they just released the SEC schedule a couple of days before we recorded this, and so I'm excited. The dogs are coming to Austin the first season that we're in the SEC, so that'll be fun. Anyway, we're not going to derail this and talk about football. I want to talk about you. So tell me about your role at Creature Comforts.
Yeah, so Director of Quality, we have 5 full-time scientists at Creature.
Wow. And that's amazing.
And a part-time application development manager. That's our quality team. So we roll pretty deep on the quality side. We'll do close to 80,000 barrels this year. But it's always something that we've taken seriously and something that we've invested a lot in. We found that, having that high quality can really set you apart in the market. And it's something that we've just taken seriously from day one. So, it's a really fantastic team. And we love to do fun new research and share whatever we find and just interact with the brewing community in general.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually how you and I met. So we met a few weekends ago at Pittsburgh during the American Society of Brewing Chemists annual meeting. So it was fun. I got to talk to you about some of that stuff. We started talking about souring and some of the research that you've done at Creature Comforts, looking at different aspects of the whole souring process. And I said, hey, let's do a kettle souring show. And you were game for it. So let's do it. All right, I guess we have to start at the top then, right? First of all, how did Creature Comforts get started brewing kettle sours?
Yeah, that was actually a day one thing. So, our core kettle sour beer and really our core kettle sour recipe is called Athena. We call it a Berliner Weiss. We say it's the champagne of the South. It's
Nice.
It's one of those fantastic summer beers. And it was one of the first beers that we released when the brewery opened in 2014. So we've been kettle souring from day one. And, our brewmaster, he picked up a lot of fantastic techniques from various breweries around the nation. And we've had some kind of interesting tweaks over the years and things that we think we do uniquely. So this year, I was looking at last year's production numbers and we did at least 3,000 barrels of kettle sours just last year. So it's kind of one of our core competencies and something that we enjoy quite a lot.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, 3,000 barrels. You guys have a bunch of brands, right? And so, I don't know where your Pilsners and stuff are stacking up on that. That's probably, or your IPA, I think, is one of your lead sellers too. But that's interesting. Wow, 3,000 barrels of kettle sours and starting it from day one. That's something that I almost never hear of, right? Most breweries are like, we had this core lineup. We were looking for something new. We started dabbling in kettle sours and now we've got, one kettle sour that we throw some fruit in occasionally, but you guys have done this from day one, and it's become something that's like kind of a core brand. Athena is a core brand for you guys.
Yeah, it's a core brand. It's something that goes in our variety packs, and we have kind of 4 different flavors of kettle sours that have different spinoffs and things like that. So we have Athena, we have Tritonia, which is the goza I mentioned with cucumber and lime, absolutely delicious. We have fruited versions of Athena that we call Athena Paradisos. And so we have a cherry, cranberry, raspberry, a passion fruit and guava, a pineapple and lemon, a dark berry one that has like black currants and stuff like that. But then we also have a series that we call Neon Cylinders, which is an 8% ABV version that is also heavily fruited. And that's one that I'm particularly proud of. It is 8%. We hit the ABV on the nose, and it is perfectly shelf stable, the way that we ferment these beers and everything like that. So,
well, I'm excited to talk about and break some of those down, especially. I think that one's going to be fun. We're going to save the 8% sour, I think, to the next segment. But I'm really excited to talk about this because in chatting with you, I realized Creature Comforts really does do some things different from like what a normal kettle sour, or like, I guess a normal, I'm going to put that in air quotes because there's a lot of different ways you can play with kettle sour. But from like a normal kettle souring process, Creature Comforts does a lot that's different. So we got to start though there right there as well, right? Not only what does Creature Comfort brew, but what is a kettle sour?
Yeah. So for us, we're generating the initial wort stream and giving it a first little boil for about 10 minutes, and then we are pitching a lactobacillus culture into it, and I know we'll spend a lot of time talking about the actual species and things like that. Then we're letting it produce lactic acid right there in the brew house until it reaches our target acidity. Then we actually harvest that culture, and then we'll boil it one more time and send it on to the fermenters. So you have this still aseptic but acidified wort going to your fermenter, which is then fermented and produces this really nice tart, but also really, really consistent product if you do it right, since you have a little bit more control over it versus like a mixed fermentation or something like that.
Yeah. That's what I was going to compare it to, is something like a mixed fermentation or mixed culture, right? I think that's what more people would consider as like a traditional American sour, where something like you're fermenting the beer and then putting it in a barrel and pitching in your microbes, or just, using the microbes that are in the barrel, I guess, oftentimes too, right? That's the kind of the distinction.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do that as well. We have our house mixed culture similar to a lot of breweries, but it's definitely smaller volume for us. We don't do nearly as much of it as we do kettle sours.
Yeah. I mean, I understand that too. Like, there's a lot of things, especially with those mixed culture fermentations. A lot of it is inconsistent, like you said, right? Sometimes you never know what you're going to get. You might get something that tastes really good, or you might get something that tastes like vinegar, and it kind of happens. Or you might get something super barnyardy that you didn't really want to be like, stinky. But in any event, so I guess that kind of answers the question then. So y'all do also make traditional sours, but kettle sours are selling more for you. People are more interested in drinking those. They're kind of light, crushable, crisp, easy to drink.
Yeah, absolutely. And time-wise, they've been fantastic to brew as well. So our core Athena Berliner Weiss, it's about 10 days grain to glass. So it's fantastic from a production standpoint. Those the mixed culture beers, we definitely love them. We tend to keep them kind of on the, I guess I would say, the higher end, where we're using really special locally grown ingredients, working with the seasonality over the years and stuff like that. But for core year-round stuff, we're sticking with the kettle sours.
That's awesome, and it creates a consistent product too, which is great. We're going to talk more about that, and how you make sure that you have the same product every time. But let's then talk about Creature Comfort's process. So why don't we? How about you start us off? Where would you like to start in terms of how you do a kettle sour at Creature Comforts, and kind of as we go along, we'll highlight those things that Creature Comfort sort of does differently.
Yeah. So I'll couch it by saying, we have 3 brew houses. We have the original location in Athens, Georgia. The main production facility in Athens, Georgia was about a mile and a half away. And then, as you mentioned, we're getting ready to open up Los Angeles. All 3 of those brew houses are 4-vessel systems. So anything that we do related to kettle sours, anything that I mentioned, I am talking about a 4-vessel system. Um, so we do a couple of different things. So we'll mash in just like any other beer. Um, Typically, we're mashing for about 30 minutes, just single step infusion, but then we'll actually pre acidify the wort before pitching in the culture a little bit. And so we'll use either acidulated malt or just lactic acid and bring the pH down to about 4.7.
Oh, okay. Wow. Yeah.
Then we'll send it over to the kettle and, well, send it to the lauter, send it to the kettle, boil it for just 10 minutes. And then we'll cool it down with a heat exchanger. At the original facility, we use just the main heat X for the wort line. At the large production facility, we actually have a separate dedicated heat X just for our kettle sours, where we'll cool it down to 115 degrees Fahrenheit and then send it over to the kettle. At the large production facility, we also have a Venturion line where we're dosing CO2 while we're knocking out into the kettle and getting some nice CO2 blanket there. At the smaller facility, we'll just wait until the kettle's full, and then we'll actually hook up CO2 to the bottom of the kettle and bubble up CO2 through it. And that helps knock out some of the oxygen in the wort and also build a CO2 blanket on top of it in the vessel. And that's one thing that we found is really, really critical for the consistency of a process and for quick souring. And when I say quick, I mean quick. Our kettle sours will acidify to our target pH, which is 3.45, in 2.5 to 4 hours.
No way. 2.5 hours? Really?
2.5 to 4 hours. And everyone kind of does a spit take when they hear that and they think we're joking. We're not.
That's amazing.
We've had a couple kettle sours that went up to 16 hours, and our brewers complained for months about it, how hellaciously slow they were.
Yeah. I mean, that was a big problem whenever I was working at Blue Owl, is because, the kettle sours take, a long period of time. I mean, you're looking at 12 to 18 hours. And at Blue Owl, it was just a 2-vessel system with a bunch of modifications. So it's not like a normal brew house, but it was modified to brew sour beers. But it does. You still have to wait that time, and it's kind of a production drag because you're stuck. All of your wort or your beer is just stuck there while it's souring and tying up your brew house. So it makes the brewers kind of mad. But okay, there's so much to unpack there. So thank you for the general overview of what that looks like, your process. But I want to sort of step back and get into some of the details of these things. And the first thing was you said you do a normal mash in your mash tun. But what kinds of are you using different types of grains, or what kind of grains are you using for that?
Yeah. So we use Canada Malting's Superior Pils as our base malt for everything. It's a great malt. We love it. And then most of these beers have a pretty heavy wheat percentage. And we used to use a white malted wheat from Canada. And actually, a couple years ago, we switched over to a locally grown Georgia hard red wheat, and we did a whole big fun project with flavor matching and 14 different wheat varieties and all this sort of stuff. And so all the wheat going into our kettle sours now is actually locally grown just down the road from Athens, Georgia, and then malted at Epiphany Malting in North Carolina.
Oh man, I love a red wheat. I throw a little bit in the Kolsch that I make, just a little bit, like 5% in there, and it just makes it nice and beautiful. Nice. That's really interesting. So you said when you were switching malts, this is something, I don't want to derail us too far off on this topic, but when you're switching that wheat, you had to compare it to 15 different yeast varieties to pick the one that is going to be the base for Athena.
Well, we were looking at wheat varieties. Yeah. So we reached out, and Hartwick College, they're incredibly kind. They sent down 14 different varieties that they knew could grow well in Georgia.
And that's where Harmony Bettenhausen is at now, right? At Hartwick.
Yep. She's fantastic. And it was Aaron McLeod, her predecessor, who sent those samples down to us. And we were looking for something that could be flavor matched, with our wheat, but also something that could work for the farmer and something that could work for the maltster. And we ended up landing on a variety called Viper, and it was fantastic. We still had to do a couple little recipe tweaks to get the exact kind of flavor matching. So we ended up adding a little bit of Vienna malt to get a little bit more of the bready character that we're missing with the white wheat. And we also added some midnight wheat to get a little bit more color because we were missing a little bit more color. But after that, we got the flavors matched pretty bang on.
Nice. So your grain bill then is like mostly pills with a percentage of wheat. How much percent of wheat is it range or vary?
It's for Athena, it's right at 26%.
Okay, nice. It's 26%, and then a little bit of Vienna and a little bit of dark. Wait, I'm sorry. What was the last one? The color malt.
It's a midnight wheat.
Midnight wheat. There we go. So the debittered dark wheat. That's nice. Oh, cool. And so then the color. What kind of color are you looking at in this? Is it like dark, copper, or is it like just light and Bud Light color?
It's a little bit in between. It's not real light in color like a traditional Berliner Weiss might be almost white. It definitely has some color to it, and it was kind of wild. That was actually one of the hardest things to match. So for an 85 barrel batch of Athena, we're adding 1 pound of midnight wheat.
Oh my gosh, that's like nothing.
Yeah,
1 pound. That's like I'm not quite at homebrew levels. It's still a little bit bigger, but for 85 barrels, 1 pound. Wow.
1 pound. We kept tweaking between 0.75 and 1.25.
Oh my goodness.
Just kind of playing with this window. And yeah, we landed on 1 pound.
Oh, so that's fun. See, this is why I love the breweries that are committed to like science and tweaking the recipes. I mean, a lot of breweries out there are, but the ones that like really get down into the details and the weeds, I love that. Okay. So that's, I think, grain bill. So you mash sort of normally. And then I think you said you transfer the mash over to, probably over to the lauter tun and then the wort over into the kettle. Boil it for 10 minutes. And I'm guessing that's just to kill off anything that would be in the grains themselves, right?
Yeah, we'll do that little pre-acidifying before moving it over to the lauter, get it down to 4.7. But yeah, then it's lautering just like normal. And exactly, we're doing that initial boil to kill off anything else and create that nice aseptic wort.
So let me ask you about the pre-acidifying, because that's really interesting to me. That's something that I hadn't heard before. Why pre-acidify the wort? Is it you find that the lacto gets started better, or like what's the
Absolutely. Yeah. Lactobacillus, it's producing that acid because it wants to be in an acidic environment. And so we kind of help it along just a little bit. And we found that pre-acidifying really helps just jumpstart the culture, puts it in its nice happy place. Yeast has its happy place. Other organisms have their happy place. Lacto has its, and it likes that lower pH. So we kind of help it out.
I wonder if that's also what's helping you with the kettle sour time. Like, right, you're just letting it go in its ideal conditions. It's not having to, suffer, I guess, in basic conditions or basic conditions to itself. Right. I mean, we're still talking about, your mash is still probably somewhere between 5.2 to 5.6. So you're just lowering it down to, 4.7 and then pitching your lacto.
Yep, exactly.
Right. And then 2.5 to 4 hours. That's nuts. I don't understand. Oh, there was one other thing. Sorry. And this was probably another thing that is helping the timing. It's the CO2 bubbling through the lines. That's fascinating. Talk to me about that and the reasons why you do that.
Yeah, so there are two things that we found that our house lactobacillus culture, and I think most lactobacillus cultures out there, are just highly, highly sensitive to, and that's oxygen and hops. And so we took our culture just, for funsies. I've grown it many, many times on Petri dishes in the lab. And if we grow it aerobically, just sitting there in the incubator, it might be 7 to 10 days before you see like the tiniest little speckle of colonies growing on the plate.
Oh, wow.
But if we put it on a plate anaerobically without oxygen, it'll completely overgrow it by the time you come in the next morning.
Wow.
And so the culture just really, really does not like oxygen. And so we combat it pretty heavily just to, give it that best shot at multiplying and souring.
Yeah, that's a pretty intensive process though to like bubble CO2. I mean, it's cool, right? You're using stuff you're using equipment that most breweries already have, right? Most breweries are already doing that with oxygen when they're transferring wort over to the fermenters, right? To like oxygenate the beer. You're just using CO2 instead of oxygen. That's a really ingenious idea. So you've created two really ideal conditions for this lacto to work. You've pre-acidified the mash and you've tried to eliminate as much oxygen as possible, which oxygen is somewhat toxic to some of those lactobacillus species. And so that's how you get your souring time down to 2.5 or 4 hours. Again, I'm just still blown away. I've made a whole bunch of kettle sours in my life, and I don't think I've ever made one that was less than like 12 hours, let's say, maybe 10 hours, but I've never made one that was less than 12. Even at higher temperatures, like you said, you're at 115, which that's kind of a normal souring temperature, is my understanding. Maybe a little bit warm, but also just really nice. 115 Fahrenheit's a nice temperature, but still, that's crazy. 2.5 to 4 hours. I'm still blown away by that.
Yeah, one of the other key things that we found, and this is something that when we're helping other brewers troubleshoot their kettle sours, is kind of one of our first go-tos, is any hop residue. And when I say any, I mean any. It was actually one of the big pain points when we opened up our new production facility, was figuring out all the CIP pathways and all these little nooks and crannies that, were a little hard to see on, the PNIDs. And we were getting tiny little hop residue into the culture, and it would completely wreck our souring times. And so that's one reason why we have the separate heat exchanger just for kettle sours at the main facility. That way that heat exchanger has never, ever touched hops, and it never will.
I see.
It makes it easier to keep it clean. But, we do use our regular heat exchanger at the main production facility, and we get great short sours with that, but we have to absolutely clean the heck out of it, and the kettle as well. If there are any hops, and if anyone's, mash hopping, it could definitely have an effect. And so anything that culture is going to touch, you got to get the hops off.
That's hilarious, because when you said that you had a dedicated heat exchanger at the production brewery, I was like, oh yeah, of course, so that you don't get like your lacto to spoil the beer or whatever, right? I hope I'm not the only person that immediately jumped to that conclusion. But you're not trying to keep the sour beer away from the non-sour beer. You're trying to keep the non-sour beer away from the lacto, right? You're trying to keep all those hops and any hop residues away. So it has nothing to do with protecting like the Pilsners and the IPAs. It's exactly the opposite. It's protecting the integrity of the kettle sour.
Yep, exactly.
Oh,
exactly.
That's amazing. That's really cool. So, all right. So I was going to ask if you add any hop additions in this. So clearly no first wort hops or anything like that, or mash hopping or any of that, because that's going to just totally wreck things for your lacto.
Oh, yeah. So we will have additions right at the end with the second boil. Once we reach our target acidity, we're going to have a second boil. So that's a really, really small addition, honestly. Most of the hop products that are going into our kettle sour is actually a Tetra ISO extract. And we use that for foam retention.
Again, yeah, this was one of the problems that we had at Blue Owl, was dealing with foam retention. And because we were seeing, crappy foam in some of the beers. And so that's what we started dosing Tetra into the bright tank as we were transferring out of the fermenter, just to improve head retention. But that's a fantastic idea, right? Is just substitute your hop addition in the kettle for that Tetra extracts to also improve your foam retention. Man, you guys have spent a lot of time looking at these sours and trying to make these great and perfect. That's awesome, and I'm glad to hear that. And then one other thing you said too, and I don't know if anybody missed it or not, but it's something I absolutely don't want to let go, because this is awesome. One of those really cool things about Creature Comforts is you said once you've done your souring, your initial souring, before running that sour wort or before boiling that sour wort, you're going to harvest the lacto from that batch.
Yep. And so once it really, really starts ripping on the acidity, so for us, we say that's when it drops below 4 pH. To give you an idea, our target for most of these beers is 3.45. We'll go higher up to like 3.6, 3.7 for some of the fruited ones, since that fruit brings in its own acidity. But, once it's below 4 on pH, we'll start harvesting. We're brewers. We're good at putting things into kegs. So we just put it into kegs. And we've been serial harvesting and repitching this culture now for 9 years.
So that's the thing. I mean, I remember when you told me this in Pittsburgh, I was like, wait a minute, you're serially repitching the same lacto culture for 9 years. And now remember, you said you made 3,000 barrels of this, and it's an 85 barrel brew house. So that means just in 2022, you did something like, I don't know, I'll do the math while you're answering this question and I'll come back with it. But that's an amazing amount of repitching just in 2022. And you've been doing this, if you've been brewing these since day one of Creature Comfort, you've been serially repitching that lacto pitch for a long time.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's really incredible. So we know what the culture started off as. It was a 50-50 blend between East Coast yeast Lactobacillus brevis and the White Labs Lactobacillus delbrueckii. And I've done full genetic sequencing on it. It is now its own species.
Oh, wow.
It is completely new to science. You look at the 16S gene, it's most closely related to Lactobacillus fermentum, but you look at the whole genome and it's its own thing at this point. And that serial repitching, it also helps us to get really high pitch volumes. And so we don't really do cell counts on the lactobacillus, that can be difficult, but we do a 5% pitch volume.
Okay.
And so it really helps kickstart that kettle souring process because we're just getting a boatload of lacto in there.
Yeah. So that's what you're pulling off then. So you're pulling off 5% of that sour wort, and then keeping that in a keg, and then just putting that 5% back into the next batch.
Yep, exactly.
Nice. And how often are y'all turning those around? How often are you doing a sour brew?
We'll typically do them just about every Monday. We'll do them on Mondays. That way we have a nice, freshly clean brew house and everything like that. It didn't just have a couple hoppy brews go through it, a few hours before. And we're typically doing that every week. Every once in a while, we'll push it to every other week. But that as well, helps us keep the culture fresh. If it goes longer than 2 weeks, then the sours start to get longer. It might get up to 8 hours or something like that. But as long as we keep it pretty short and turning, then the culture's just happy as can be, and it keeps ripping. Yeah.
Now you said that one time that the culture got up to 16, and then another time that the culture got up to 8 hours. And there was an interesting study that you talked to me about at ASBC about iron accumulation and following iron through. But I want to talk about that after we take a quick break. So we'll take a break, drink a sour beer, come back and talk more about Creature Comforts process and also some of the experiments like the iron accumulation study that you did when we come back. The new Brewbuilt X2 Unitank conical fermenter is here, and it's ready to take your brewing game to the next level. With the best interior finish, welded and polished ferrules, clear bottom chamber, pressurizable with body connect fittings, etc., Brewbuilt has managed to bring commercial level features into the homebrewing world at an unbeatable price. Now available with a professional grade glycol jacket, giving you a more sanitary environment and much greater cooling efficiency, say goodbye to clunky immersion coils with the game-changing jacketed X2. Visit morebeer.com to learn more. Most listeners know that I worked at a sour brewery in Austin, Texas called Blue Owl, which is cranking out some fantastic sour mashed beers. If you're in Texas and specifically in the Austin area, you do have to check them out. But this is a show about Creature Comforts, which brews an amazing selection of lagers and ales and IPAs, as well as Berliner Weisses, both fruited and unfruited, in their with their flagship being Athena. And we've been talking a lot about their kettle souring process and some of the issues that you've had in the brewery. And before we get to the experiments that you guys have looked at, I wanted to talk about what's your favorite Creature Comforts brand, Daniel? Do you have one? Is it a sour?
Oh man, Tritonia does have a special place in my heart. I think everyone at the brewery knows that my baby is the Silent World, though. It is a dark lager, and it's funny. We do about one batch of it a year, and you look at what employees get in allocations and what they're drinking in the tasting room, and it's like the number 3 beer for the entire year amongst employees, even though we only do one batch of it. We probably drink 70 to 80% of that batch ourselves.
It's just like an employee beer. That's fine. Yeah. That's fun. That's awesome. All right. Well, so not a sour beer, but still a fun one. All right. Well, let's talk about sours then. So I talked about the first, right before the break, I talked about this iron accumulation experiment. So talk to me about that and some of the issues that you were having with iron and your kettle sours.
Yeah, so we've noticed every once in a while with our kettle sours and ones that we'd be trying out in the market and stuff like that, a lot of times these acidic beers had a tendency to be slightly metallic and almost assuredly coming from iron atoms, and we really wanted to figure out where that was coming from and how we might be able to combat it, and just so we could create a more consistent product. And so reached out. We're here in Athens, Georgia. We have the University of Georgia. And so reached out to their Center for Applied Isotope Studies, and they have ICP-OES that they were able to do metal testing for us. And so we just started cranking out samples and sending them over to them. And we followed several Athena fermentations all the way from the kegs that we store lactoculture in, all the way through the mash water, the mash, the lauter, the initial boil, the souring, the second boil, knockout, all the way through the whirlpool into the fermenter. We followed it through fermentation. We even followed it all the way through package and up to, I think, 2 months in package to see all the iron fluctuations. And it was really interesting to see, like, our entire processes, we're very good about passivation and things like that. And even with that, we were seeing like pickup of iron during the souring process. So the longer the sour went, the more we risked getting iron content. So, we want to have those quick sours. Interestingly, we saw that the trub from the whirlpool would take out about 15% of the total metal content. And so getting really good trub removal could also combat some of those iron pickups. But the big key thing that we saw was actually during fermentation. And it was in the first 24 hours, the yeast actually suck up every single drop of the iron. But as they're going along, these are very stressful fermentations. If they start dying, it'll actually start re-releasing that iron into the beer, and you'll get it in your final product. So we do really, really aggressive yeast dumps in the first 72 hours of fermentation, and that sends most of the iron right to the drain. You'll also get the same thing if you get a lot of yeast in package. The yeast in package will slowly die off and re-release the iron. So if you end up with a lot of yeast in package, you can still get something that maybe in the bright tank doesn't present as metallic, but after a couple months in package, it'll present as metallic, which I think is something that might catch some brewers, because it tastes great when you put it in the can. But then it shifts over time. And so trying to keep all the yeast out of the package and really getting it off the bottom of the tank as fast as possible.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I the iron accumulation, it's not something that I was really aware of or familiar with at Blue Owl while I was there, but that's certainly something that I have noticed, right? Some of the sours that I've tried have this like metallic-y, or like I call it an extra twang. It's got like a little bit extra of the tartness, and it doesn't taste tart. It tastes metallic-y. But that's interesting to hear that iron is playing such a big role in the flavor and really shelf stability of this. And, how did you guys figure out that iron was the problem? Like, how did you come up with you see this metallic-y and you're just like, okay, what metals could possibly be in beer? How did you figure this out?
Yeah. It's pretty well laid out by the ASBC. If you taste metallic in a beer, it's most likely coming from iron atoms. And so we looked at a couple batches that were like presented as metallic versus ones that didn't. And you could very clearly see like elevated iron concentrations and ones that are above the accepted sensory threshold. So that's kind of a pretty big red flag for us. And that's what sent us down the rabbit hole.
Pretty obvious then. That's amazing. So just doing a regular off-flavor sensory testing led you down to start this. And then, like you said, the biggest part where the iron is getting in there is like the yeast during fermentation is taking up all of the iron. But as they're dying in these stressful, sour, acidic fermentations, they're releasing and expelling all that iron back out into the beer. That's just giving you this metallic off-flavor as it sits on the shelf.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. And we're a little bit lucky. Our house ale yeast is WLP 002. It's a British ale yeast. I think the Wyeast equivalent is 1968. And it flocculates like concrete. So it falls right to the bottom of the cone, and it takes the iron with it as well. So that makes it pretty nice for these fermentations.
Yeah, that's nice. And so your solution then is aggressive yeast dumps. So that's a really interesting one. If you're getting metallic off flavors in any of your sour beers, you might want to consider doing some of those yeast dumps, right? Like more, or rather, if you're getting metallic in your kettle sours, right? Do some aggressive yeast dumps. How often are y'all dumping the yeast?
We dump it pretty much daily up until 72 hours into fermentation. And we found that after 72 hours, basically the damage or the good is done. And so you do have to hit it early. And if anyone's curious to see the actual numbers, we've presented all of them. You can find it through the ASBC and places like that. It's all public information just out there.
Yeah, it would be cool. So if you're looking for that, just go check it out. And if you need some help finding it, just shoot me an email and I'll get you in contact with Daniel and he can provide you that information. So we talked about yeast on this, and that's an interesting question I always have for sour beers, right? Is because you're putting yeast into an environment that it doesn't like, right? I mean, 3.45, I think is what you said your target pH is. That's an environment that yeast really doesn't want to do fermentation in. It will, but it struggles a lot. So how did you guys figure out like what yeast to use? You said you use British Ale. That's your house ale yeast. And that one seems to be working well enough for you. How'd you guys figure out what yeast to use in these sour pitches, in the kettle sour pitches?
Yeah, that was pretty easy. We use the same yeast that we use for our core IPA that makes up like vast majority of the volume that we brew. And so we're harvesting all of our yeast off of an IPA. We do that pre-dry hopping, and we do mid-fermentation dry hopping. So we're harvesting that yeast like day 4 into fermentation. And
so you are harvesting the yeast. You're actually like pulling the yeast out and repitching it?
We're pulling it off an IPA, and then if we pitch it into a kettle sour, then it's dead-ended. We do have to have higher pitch rates on the kettle sour. So a typical, lower ABV, something in the 4 to 5% range ABV. We'll pitch 1.5 million cells per degree Plato. And that really helps us make sure that we hit our ABV spec. And when we get into those Neon Cylinders, that brand that's an 8% kettle sour, we actually pitch that at 2 million per mil per degree Plato. And that helps us really peg that ABV. But yeah, it's a tough fermentation. They don't like to do it.
Yeah, high alcohol, really acidic. That's going to be a big one. So all right, well, so though that's a good segue then. I think maybe this is a good time to talk about those 8%ers, right? How do you make an 8% sour? That's a huge beer. I think we've done some at Blue Owl as well, but that's a hard beer to make, right? Is to make an 8% beer or sour beer.
Yeah. So honestly, like the first time we tried it, it worked out a lot better than I expected. I was expecting us to have to make a whole lot of tweaks and adjustments and stuff like that, but we simply increased the OG of Athena. Those beers, they really are just a bigger version of our core Athena kettle sour. Make sure that our zinc is on point, make sure that the oxygen is on point, and then pitch it at 2 million cells per mil per degree Plato. Those beers and all of our fruited kettle sours, we add the fruit about day 4 in fermentation. That way there's still a little bit of active fermentation, and we're able to ferment out all the sugars and create a shelf stable product, but still get a lot of those really fantastic fruit qualities. And so we have some little adjustments that we do for ABV based on the fruit and how much we're adding, ferment it out and crash it, send it onto the bright.
Well, wow, but that's it. But do you do any like adjunct additions like sugar, like corn sugars or anything like that to get it up to 8%ers? No, it's all malt.
All malt.
Amazing. Yeah, that's really cool to do that. And also you're using the same yeast, right? The British Ale yeast.
Yep, exact same yeast. We just pitch it a little bit more. I would say these fermentations, like I said, they are stressed. At least our house ale yeast, it has pretty high amount of acetaldehyde, but we consider that true to brand for these. It brings this really nice cidery quality to the beers, and you'll get to try that. They're delicious. And so we really got to get that pitch rate right. Otherwise, our acetaldehyde levels can drift from true to brand. But that's all it took. And I was absolutely shocked. Honestly, I thought we were going to have to pull so many other levers to create this 8% beer, and it worked the first time, which like nothing ever does that.
Never works the first time. Yeah, that's amazing because I was thinking that too. I mean, you're putting yeast in a really difficult, toxic environment. And I don't know, British Ale yeast is a good attenuator and a good flocculator, so maybe it is using that specific yeast. But it's interesting too. So all of your sour beers are made using that house ale yeast, the British Ale yeast.
Yep, nice. Absolutely.
Nice. That also, I guess, helps you with consistency, right? You know how that yeast reacts in those situations. And if I heard you correctly, once you've pitched those yeasts, you will harvest those yeast from like an IPA or something. But once you pitch them into the sour, they're dead and done. No harvesting them after that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they are absolutely. That's a dead end fermentation for them. We thank them for their service, but they're done at that point.
Yeah. Is there like a specific generation that you like to get to in the IPAs, or is it just kind of like, okay, we need, yeast for a sour beer, so let's brew an IPA and then pitch it?
Yeah, that's a really fantastic question. We're doing 3 to 4 340 barrel batches of that IPA every single week, and so we have a lot of that yeast floating around. So it's what we use for pretty much everything. We'll use that yeast from that particular IPA, Tropicalia, to pitch just about any other ale. So we always have somewhere.
It's always around someplace. Nice.
Yep.
Okay, so that's the ABV ones. Anything else you want to say about the ABV ones? But I want to spend some time on fruit, because you can't talk about sour beers without fruit.
Oh yeah, they're all fruited. We love them. So
yeah, I do too.
Dig into fruit.
All right, cool. Let's dig in. All right, so first question then. You guys have a range of fruited sour beers, right? I mean, you mentioned some examples on the show, and you can mention some more of those too now. But how do you figure out what fruits you want to put into your sour beer? This isn't necessarily like a science or chemistry question. This is more just like how do you decide how you want to flavor your sour beer with fruit?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of it comes down to, brewer inspirations and things like that. A lot of these are just kind of combos that we've had either in food or drink elsewhere that we really, really enjoy. Some of them, there's a little bit of seasonality to it. So we do one called Dark Berry that's like black currant and things like that. And that one's fantastic during the winter. We have one that's cherry, cranberry, raspberry. That's just this brilliant red. And so, of course, we release it for Valentine's Day every year.
Nice. Yeah.
It's a delicious beer. So there's a little bit of that to it. One of the biggest things that we've run into with choosing the fruits, though, is over the years, it can be difficult to source the exact same fruit sometimes. Like it just might not be available. Depending on the harvest and things like that. And so we have had to pivot some years and source different types of fruit. We had to change our cherry source the other year for that cherry, cranberry, raspberry beer. And that was a learning process. Like the stuff that we landed on was much thicker, and just trying to figure out how to mix it in the tank was a really interesting process, and kind of drove our cellar mad. They tried every pump they had, it still wasn't moving. It was interesting. So that's one of the biggest things for us has been like every once in a while throughout the years we have to shift some other fruit source just because of availability. And so we'll sit down. Luckily, we have Athena everywhere all day long, and so we'll actually do little small blending labs in the lab, and we'll do tetrad panels and things like that to make sure that we're really going to peg this thing and do it right.
Cool. And so like that's kind of like the sensory perspective, but what about other, like you just mentioned a very practical consideration about your fruit source, right? Is you have this puree that it's just not mixing. It's not mixing in to the beer. That's a very practical consideration. I mean, I remember one time that I was working, we had gotten some different purees than we were used to, and they had a little bit higher water content, and so whenever I put them in, I crashed the fermenter a little bit earlier and froze the beer. Which is fine. Just raise it back up a little bit and it'll thaw. But in any event, so like there are other things like practical considerations that you're worried about with fruit. You mentioned earlier, like change in sugar content, right? Additional fermentables, pH change, shelf stability, all this stuff. Talk to us about those.
Yeah. I mean, you brought it up well. I mean, they're all factors. And so we're definitely, thankfully, all the COAs from these suppliers, they do have Brix calculations on there. So you can do that. We'll even dilute down the fruits, spin it down, and then run it on our density meter to see what type of sugars, or at least the quantity of sugars that came off and what we might expect in the beer. Want to make sure that we're able to hit our ABV on these and that they're not going to get too hot or anything like that. There's some interesting things with certain fruits, if they might not bring the entire fruit quality that you want. So we found that like pineapple can be particularly difficult to work with. And so we'll actually use some pineapple extracts just as a little bit of a top-up note whenever we work with pineapple, because you can throw absolutely ungodly quantities of pineapple puree into a beer, and it still doesn't quite taste like that really popping pineapple. So we found little tricks like that.
Yeah. I was thinking about peaches in my head. That was one. I mean, Georgia. I mean, you've got to have a Georgia peach beer, right?
we do, and that one, it's called Pearson, and that's one that we actually keep segregated just for the mixed fermentation project. So every single year, we get peaches from Pearson Farms in Georgia, and they bring them up, they hand deliver them to us. It's a fantastic relationship, and we'll add them to that beer. It's really sad though. This year, there's not really going to be a Georgia peach crop, so I don't think we'll be able to do Pearson this year.
Oh no! What's going on? Some sort of disease pressure or heat, or just who knows?
It was a combination. So peaches, they need a certain number of cold nights during the winter, and we did not get those this winter, and so the majority of peach trees just never really bloomed. There are some varieties that it can tolerate hotter nights, and Pearson Farms does have some of those. But then we got about 3 or 4 nights where things went below freezing, right as the blooms had come in. And so the ones that did survive and bloom then got killed off. So
oh gosh,
it's not going to be such a good peach year.
Oh no peaches. But anyway, well, so I brought up peaches because that's one of those flavors that I notoriously find like you just got to add I mean, if it's an 85 barrel fermenter, you have to add 80 barrels of peaches in order to get peach flavor. Maybe not that much, but that's what it feels like sometimes. And especially because all that sugar is also just going to ferment away. It's kind of impressive to just like throw like a whole peach into a fermenter and then come back a couple days later and there's this beautiful pristine pit that's in there that's like been like looks like it's been like acid washed or something. But in any event, okay, so back to the like adding fruits and things like that. Do you have difficulties with pH or with like shelf stability with your fruit additions?
The shelf stability, thankfully not. Honestly, these beers are some of our most shelf stable. You can keep these things at room temp, honestly, and they taste great months later, which is pretty shocking. But the pH is definitely a thing. So whenever we're going to add fruit, instead of bringing it down to that 3.45 pH, we'll target closer to 3.6 to 3.7, depending on the fruits. And that way we're not going to have just something that's like way too tart at the end, because those fruits definitely bring a good bit of acid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So a lot of things to think about with fruit, but it sounds like for the most part, fruit is complementary, right? It's like as long as you're adjusting for the pH up front, adding the fruits that you want and getting the flavors in, don't be afraid to add some extract, that kind of stuff. It sounds like it's kind of just a nice layering addition for additional flavor and character on top of these kettle sours.
Oh yeah, it's fantastic. We love to play with them.
Yeah. Okay, and then 2 visual things, right? One is you talked about foam already. I was going to ask about that, but then also a lot of sour beers I've noticed have this like what I've come to call a lacto haze, right, or like a sour beer haze. Do you guys do anything to combat the haze? Do you embrace the haze? And then same thing with foam. It sounds like you already mentioned the Tetra product earlier, but let's talk about those 2 visual things with kettle sours.
Yeah. So we really like the Tetra ISO to help with foam stability and things like that. So we're using it hot side. I'm curious to hear more about your experience cold side. I think that's fascinating. But the haze has been something that it's been really difficult, even with that incredibly high wheat content in these beers. We would prefer to have a little bit of haziness in these beers, especially the non-fruited ones, but it's been really difficult to get that consistent. And so all of our beers are centrifuged through a GEA centrifuge, and we've landed on, like we were trying to get these things a little bit hazy, and then it would just keep falling clear in the package. And so we typically just spin out the haze now and it gets fairly clear, but it'd be nice to have a little bit in there, but it was really hard to be consistent. So I'd say we're less fighting the haze. We'd love to invite a little bit of it, but we'll take consistency over something inconsistent any day.
Yeah. Rather it be consistent than some beers hazy and some beers not hazy. Yeah, that's an interesting one. And so the centrifuge is actually working, getting most of that haze out, getting it nice and clear.
Yep, absolutely.
Great.
Yep.
Nice. Okay. Well, do you use any fining agents or anything like that, like biofine or gelatin or nothing? Nope, just centrifuge.
Just centrifuge. Yep.
Yeah, cool. All right. And then so one more thing to discuss before we sort of wrap up the show. You mentioned earlier mixed cultures, and I think we should spend a couple minutes talking about that, right? Because you also are doing mixed culture fermentations at Creature Comforts.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, those are a lot of fun. I wish consumers bought more of them so we could brew more of them.
Right, especially from the side, especially the microbiologist, right? That's super fun to just try all these different things and see what comes out.
Yeah, we've done full metagenomic sequencing on our house mixed culture as well as cultures from 18 breweries across the United States, and it was a really fun project. It was like 400 gigabytes worth of sequencing data.
Oh my God.
Yeah. But our house mixed culture, we know it's all Brettanomyces and actually Pediococcus. We do that purposely. We actually hop pretty aggressively on our mixed culture beers to make sure that the bacterial population doesn't get out of control and make things too acidic or strange. And then the vast majority of our mixed culture fermentations, we're actually doing a primary fermentation, usually a lager, a saison, and then once that's completely fermented out, then we'll add our house culture. And limiting the food for those organisms, it really creates this nice acidity instead of just something that rips your tongue off.
Yeah. Or is enamel peeling or anything. And how long do those mixed culture fermentations take? Are you putting them in barrels, or are you just leaving them in the tanks for a little bit, or what's going on?
All of the above. Yeah, we have some stainless steel totes. We have wine barrels. We have 3 large fooders. So a little bit of everything. They'll typically go for anywhere from 4 to 8 to 10 months before we move them over to package.
Yeah. Makes sense. And that's cool too, right? And so it's a fun way, right, to look at both sides of the process, right? The kettle sour is nice, refreshing, crisp, drinkable, 3,000 barrels a year of it. So plenty, clearly you're selling it well in the market. But then you have also the mixed culture piece of this too, which is a little bit more complexity. You've got some Brett and some Pediococcus in there as well, heavily hopped, which it sounds like Athena is not, right? Athena is very much not heavily hopped.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And even any of your fruited beers probably also not very heavily hopped either.
Yeah, all those they're just Athena that we change the pH target and then chuck fruit on top of it.
And then chuck fruit on top of it. Yeah. Oh man, those sounds so good. I'm excited to try some of those. And so I think that makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, it's really cool to hear about all these different processes that you do. Serially repitching your lacto, that's something that's pretty awesome. Continuing to repitch that, managing your oxygen controls during your souring process, getting your souring time down to 2.5 to 4 hours by pre-acidifying and by bubbling CO2 in. And then when you're pitching yeast, just letting it go and letting it have a good time. That British ale yeast, making sure that it's got the conditions that it needs to survive, but making really nice crushable kettle sour beers. I always ask this question towards the end of the show. If you want brewers to take away just one thing from today's episode, what would it be?
You can create consistent kettle sours. I think some people think that there's still a little bit of black magic, but I think you can create really consistent beers if you're just paying really close attention to your processes. And it doesn't matter how much you like hops, how much we're all hop heads, keep them away from kettle sours or you're going to have a bad time.
Exactly, right? Keep those hops away from your kettle sours. That's so interesting. And, be mindful of dumping your yeast as well to get rid of that iron accumulation if you're having metallic. Well, there was lots of things that I've learned today about kettle souring, and I'm hoping the listeners have as well. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to today? I'm sure there's a lot, but...
Oh, I think we covered a lot. Excited for you to try some of these beers.
All right, man. Well, sounds good. I'm happy to. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for joining me in the Brew Lab.
Yeah, thank you, Cade.
All right, there will be a link to Creature Comforts website where if you live in Georgia or soon to be in Los Angeles, you can check out Athena, their straight Berliner Weiss, and the Atheno Paradiso series of fruited sours, along with all the other great beers they're brewing over at Creature Comforts. Next week, Jordan and I will be back applying the science to kettle souring, and we'll see y'all then. The Brew Lab is a production of Brewlosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brewlosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.